licensed sex workers had limited protection. They were required to undergo medical examinations, particularly during outbreaks of venereal disease, though the understanding of disease transmission remained crude. Unlicensed prostitution, by contrast, was criminalized. Women working outside designated areas or without approval risked fines, imprisonment, or public whipping. For the women themselves, sex work offered few paths to escape. Many were driven into it by poverty, widowhood, or abandonment. Others were sold or coerced into the trade by family members or brothel keepers. Few left voluntarily. Surviving records such as petitions in English borough courts or notarial archives in Italy show women attempting to reclaim unpaid wages, escape abuse, or marry out of the trade, often with little success. Despite vows of celibacy, members of the clergy were frequent clients. In 14th century London, the Bishop of Winchester controlled brothels in Dark, a district just outside the city's legal jurisdiction. These stews, as they were called, operated openly and were a source of steady income. In Avignon, during the papacy's residence there in the 14th century, complaints about clerical involvement in prostitution were common enough to warrant official inquiries. The existence of prostitution invited recurring waves of moral panic. It was blamed for outbreaks of disease, especially syphilis, and for moral decline in urban centers. Reform movements, such as those inspired by mendicant orders like the Franciscans, pushed for crackdowns. Yet when closures were attempted, sex work often went underground, harder to control, and even more dangerous for those involved. Prostitution in the medieval world reflected its contradictions: publicly condemned, privately tolerated, economically useful, and always defined by power. Medieval Europe publicly condemned sex, desire as sin, a crime against both church and state. Officially labeled as sodomy, the term was used broadly, covering a range of non-procreative acts, but especially targeting male same-sex relations. Despite the severity of its legal and theological treatment, records from court proceedings, ecclesiastical rulings, and inquisitorial archives reveal that such relationships did exist, often hidden, sometimes tolerated, and occasionally punished with brutal consequences. Secular and church authorities in cities like Florence, Paris, and London implemented sodomy laws, but enforcement was inconsistent. In Florence, during the 14th century, the officially DNOT, the Office of the Knight, was created specifically to investigate and prosecute male homosexual activity. Between 1432 and 1502, over 17,000 men were investigated, though relatively few were executed. Punishments included public humiliation, fines, exile, and, in extreme cases, death by burning. In clerical and monastic settings, same-sex emotional and physical relationships were not uncommon, though typically cloaked in religious language or buried under accusations of heresy. The historian John Boswell highlighted liturgical texts from the 10th to 14th centuries that appear to bless same-sex unions, including adelphopoiesis, brother-making ceremonies found in the Byzantine Church. Whether these rites represented romantic or sexual unions remains debated, but they show that expressions of deep male affection had a space, albeit ambiguous, within religious life. In female convents, same-sex intimacy is recorded in visitations and disciplinary records. In 1477, for instance, Abbess Agnes of Eeltien in the Holy Roman Empire was accused of having intimate relationships with several nuns. Punishments for women were generally milder than for men, but reputations and religious vocations were still destroyed. Gender nonconformity also appears in the margins of medieval records. Some individuals dressed, lived, and worked in roles traditionally assigned to the opposite sex. In 14th century London, John Rykener was arrested while dressed as a woman and working as a sex worker under the name Eleanor. His case, recorded in city court rolls, shows not only the existence of gender fluidity, but also the complex social reactions to it, combining legal scrutiny, curiosity, and moral condemnation. Same-sex desire in medieval Europe was not absent, it was hidden, coded, and heavily policed. While the official stance was one of punishment and erasure, the records that survive tell a more complicated story, one of secrecy, resilience, and a constant negotiation between private reality and public danger. While the medieval world was built on obedience to church, to family, to custom, not everyone submitted without question. Some resisted, quietly, defiantly, or through legal challenge. Individuals pushed back against systems that denied them choice in love, marriage, and bodily autonomy. Court records from England, France, and the Low Countries show that some peasants used canon law to their advantage. Church courts recognized clandestine marriages if mutual consent was present, even without parental approval or formal ceremony. This loophole allowed young couples, especially those from lower classes, to marry secretly. If consummated and witnessed, the church often upheld these unions. Annulments became a rare but critical tool. In 9th century Italy, Deuteberger wife of King Lothair II appealed to the Pope to escape her husband's efforts to dissolve their marriage in favor of a concubine. After years of legal and theological battles, Pope Nicholas I sided with her, asserting church authority over royal will. Her case reinforced ecclesiastical control over marriage and set precedents for women's legal recourse. Other women fled entirely. In 14th century Bologna, court documents describe girls escaping forced marriages by seeking sanctuary in convents or appealing to local bishops. In some cases, they won the right to remain unmarried or choose their own partners. Rare, but legally possible. Urban centers like Paris and London produced more evidence of resistance, especially among literate or economically independent women. Some drafted prenuptial agreements, secured property rights, or filed complaints against abusive husbands. A small number, especially widows, used their legal freedom to reject remarriage altogether. These acts did not overturn the system, but they exposed its limits. Across the medieval centuries, small revolts in law, in love, in court, planted the first seeds of personal agency. They mark the early, fragile beginnings of the right to choose. The Virgin Mary emerged as the exception to the rule. She was celebrated, not just as the mother of Christ, but as a perpetual virgin, untouched, pure, and passive. This ideal created an impossible binary. A woman was either like Mary, silent, obedient, and chaste, or like Eve, whose curiosity and desire had shattered paradise. There was no middle ground. Real women, with bodies, thoughts, and desires, were left outside the ideal. The more virtuous they tried to be, the more the standard shifted toward the unreachable. Celibacy became the solution. By the 12th century, it was a requirement for priests in the Latin Church, yet it also created tension. As clerics swore off marriage and sexual activity, many struggled privately. Some broke their vows, keeping concubines in secret. Others externalized their guilt by blaming women for their temptations. Female bodies became scapegoats, symbols of spiritual danger. This was not abstract theology. It had concrete outcomes. Women were banned from priesthood. They were excluded from the altar. Legal codes inspired by canon law restricted their public roles. Their voices were marginalized in councils, synods, and church courts. Even widows and virgins, praised in writing, were often kept under male guardianship by turning the female body into a site of moral danger. The church reinforced a worldview where women were to be controlled, watched, and judged. The anxieties of male theologians hardened into policies, sermons, and punishments. Sexual fear became doctrine, and for generations, women lived under its shadow. In medieval Europe, medicine operated under a framework inherited from the classical world, particularly the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen. But these ideas, filtered through centuries of interpretation by Christian scholars, often blended more with theology and folklore than with empirical observation. The female body, in particular, became the focus of widespread misunderstanding, speculation, and fear. One of the most enduring medical theories of the period was the notion of the wandering womb. First proposed in ancient Greek texts, it reappeared in medieval medical manuals with alarming persistence. Physicians believed the uterus was not fixed in place but could travel throughout the body, causing physical and psychological illness. If a woman became hysterical, suffered from anxiety, fainting, or seizures, many doctors blamed the womb. Treatments ranged from unpleasant herbal fumigations to the application of sweet-smelling substances near the genitals to lure the womb back into place. This wasn't seen as absurd at the time. It was codified in the Tritula, a widely circulated 12th century medical text focused on women's health. Attributed to the Salernitane Medical School in southern Italy, it became a reference point across Europe. The text acknowledged female pleasure and even recommended that men ensure their wives' satisfaction during sex, but this was framed within the goal of ensuring conception. The female orgasm was not seen as pleasurable in its own right, but as medically necessary to achieve pregnancy. If it was present without pregnancy, or pleasure occurred outside of marriage, it became a problem, an excess, something to be restrained. Medieval physicians also feared what they did not understand. Menstruation, for example, was often regarded as a form of bodily impurity, a monthly bleeding that rid the female body of excess heat or toxins. Some believed menstrual blood could spoil crops, rust metal, or cause disease in others. The idea that women were physically unclean during their periods fed into wider systems of social and religious exclusion. In some regions, menstruating women were barred from entering churches or touching sacred objects. Anatomical knowledge was limited. Human dissection was rare and controversial before the 14th century. So much of what physicians believed came from animal dissections or texts. The female body was often viewed as a defective version of the male body, colder, wetter, and prone to imbalance. Galenic theory classified women as having more passive, porous bodies. This, combined with Christian ideas of sin and temptation, led to the portrayal of women as biologically predisposed to lust. Medical writers like Bernard de Gordon described women as being more susceptible to carnal passions, especially when their bodily humors were imbalanced, a condition they believed was common and chronic. These theories didn't remain. In academic circles, they shaped how midwives treated patients, how ecclesiastical courts judged sexual behavior, and how society responded to women who acted outside expectations. A woman who was outspoken, sexually assertive, or simply unmarried past a certain age could be labeled as mentally unstable, morally deviant, or even dangerous. Female sexuality wasn't just misunderstood, it was pathologized. The fusion of faulty science and cultural anxiety turned the female body into a site of fear. What wasn't known was invented. What couldn't be controlled was medicalized. Across Europe, in monasteries, town halls, and homes. This pseudo-scientific worldview gave men yet another justification to monitor, diagnose, and punish the physical autonomy of women. By the late 15th century, the fear of women's sexuality had taken on a darker, more destructive form. What had once been managed through religious doctrine and social restriction now became the focus of organized persecution. Across large parts of Europe, especially in the German-speaking regions, France, and the Swiss Confederacy, tens of thousands of women, often poor, elderly, unmarried, or simply outspoken, were accused of witchcraft. The common thread running through many of these accusations was sex. The publication of the Maleficarum in 1487 marked a turning point. Written by Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, this Latin manual became the de facto guidebook for identifying and prosecuting witches. Its central argument was clear. Women were more prone to witchcraft because of their carnal desires, weak faith, and natural deceitfulness. It framed female sexuality not just as a moral failing, but as a doorway to demonic possession and heresy. The text cited the story of Eve as evidence of woman's inherent susceptibility to temptation and made repeated references to women's bodies as instruments of the devil. The authors claimed that witches engaged in pacts with Satan that often involved sexual acts, and that demons, in the form of incubi and succubi, targeted women through dreams or night visitations. The result was a framework where female desire became indistinguishable from devilry. Such beliefs were not merely symbolic. They were applied in courtrooms, inquisitorial hearings, and torture chambers. Records from the Basel witch trials in Switzerland between 1470 and 1490 show women confessing, under duress, to sexual congress with demons. One woman, Walpurga Hausmanin, was executed in 1587 after being accused of killing infants with sorcery and consorting with Satan in the form of a man. Her confession, extracted after days of torture, included claims that the devil had seduced her during sleep and marked her body with invisible signs. Accusations often targeted women who lived outside traditional roles, healers, and midwives. These women occupied a dangerous space. They handled the mysteries of birth, herbs, and female ailment sarias, largely untouched by male physicians or clergy. Their knowledge was practical, passed down orally, and often outside formal institutions. That independence became suspect. In some cases, midwives were accused of using their position to harm infants or sabotage pregnancies. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, the criminal code of the Holy Roman Empire issued in 1532, specifically referenced witches causing miscarriages and killing children. In Würzburg, during the intense witch trials of the 1620s, several women were charged with casting spells on newborns or using their breast milk in unholy rituals. The fear was not only about sorcery, but about control, especially control over reproduction, health, and the limits of female agency. A woman who expressed sexuality outside marriage, or one who held knowledge not sanctioned by male authority, became a threat to both social and spiritual order. Sexual themes appeared constantly in these accusations. Testimonies described witches attending sabbats, engaging in orgies, and kissing the devil's anusa, detail repeated in trial after trial. These grotesque and graphic charges weren't products of evidence, but of imagination shaped by religious fear, misogyny, and deep-rooted cultural anxieties about women's autonomy. Between 1450 and 1750, estimates suggest that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe. Around 75 to 85% of them were women. The overwhelming pattern across these trials was clear. Women who did not conform socially, sexually, or religiously were at greater risk of accusation. The witch hunts were never only about superstition. They were a mechanism of control. Through them, authorities targeted female sexuality, wisdom, and independence by branding them as threats, not just to morality, but to the very soul of Christendom. In the courts of medieval Europe, a paradox was taking shape. As church and law cast suspicion on women's bodies, noble culture began to elevate them through poetry, ritual, and spectacle. Courtly love, a literary and social code that emerged in the 12th century, portrayed women as distant muses, adored, idolized, and placed high on pedestals. But behind this reverence was not liberation, it was containment. The concept of courtly love took hold in the courts of Occitania in southern France. Poets known as troubadours composed verses praising noble women, often married ones, as paragons of grace, virtue, and beauty. The male lover, usually of lower status, vowed loyalty, secrecy, and suffering in pursuit of a woman who was unattainable by design. These relationships were fictional, symbolic, and intentionally unconsummated. Desire was expressed, but never fulfilled. On the surface, these poems appeared to venerate women. In works like Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Chrétien des Troyes, told of knights who risked death and honor for the favor of a lady. Andreas Capellanus, writing D'Amour around 1185, offered a guide to the behaviors and codes of love among the elite. But the structure was rigid. Women were admired only when they fit a narrow mold, virtuous, passive, and inaccessible. Their power existed only within the poetic frame, and only as an object of male devotion. Outside the literature, the lives of noble women told a different story. Marriage was rarely about romance. It was a strategic alliance arranged to consolidate land, wealth, and influence. Women were often married off in their early teens, and their role was defined by loyalty to their husband and the production of legitimate heirs. Love had no place in legal contracts or dowry negotiations. The imagery of courtly love also deflected attention from real anxieties about female autonomy. The ideal woman of poetry, silent, modest, and emotionally distant, was a constructed foil to the perceived threat of the outspoken or sexually autonomous woman. In contrast to the feared temptress or supposed witch, the courtly lady was safe, idealized, but ultimately voiceless. For the nobility, this fantasy served a purpose. It allowed elite men to express desire while keeping actual women under control. It preserved a hierarchy in which men were active participants, writers, knights, rulers, and women remained symbolic. Even in literature, when women were portrayed as powerful, that power was conditional and rarely exercised outside the bounds of male approval. By the 13th and 14th centuries, this ideal had become a cultural masque to romanticize a system that offered women status without agency, reverence without freedom. Courtly love wasn't a celebration of female empowerment. It was a refined way of rewriting subordination into beauty. In medieval Europe, female sexuality was not only a subject of religious doctrine and medical theory, it was a matter of public order. The legal systems of the time, whether governed by canon law feudal custom, or emerging civic codes, were deeply invested in regulating women's sexual behavior. Morality was not private. It was policed, judged, and punished in full view of society. Adultery, fornication, and seduction were treated as moral crimes, but only selectively. Men who engaged in extramarital sex, especially of noble status, often faced little consequence. For women, the stakes were different. Their bodies were tied to honor of family, husband, and community. When a woman was accused of sexual misconduct, punishment followed not only through the church, but also through public institutions. In cities like Florence, Nuremberg, and London, civic courts held jurisdiction over offenses such as incontinence or moral corruption. Women found guilty of fornication, especially outside marriage or with a man of higher rank, could be fined, imprisoned, or publicly humiliated. In many towns, repeat offenders were paraded through the streets, forced to wear symbolic clothing, tattered garments, iron collars, or heavy weights. The aim was not rehabilitation. It was spectacle. Virginity, particularly among the upper classes, carried significant legal weight. A noblewoman's marriage prospects depended on it, and so did her family's reputation. Allegations of premarital sex could prompt forced virginity, tests carried out by midwives, clerics, or local authorities. These procedures were invasive, humiliating, and medically baseless, relying on the supposed presence of an intact hymen. If the test was failed, even under coercion or assault, the consequences could be severe: annulled engagements, social ostracization, or forced entry into a convent. One recorded case from 14th century Paris tells of a young woman accused of promiscuity after a broken betrothal. Her former fiancé claimed she was no longer a virgin. A panel of matrons was appointed to examine her. The verdict delivered without consent led to her confinement and expulsion from the city. She had no legal grounds to protest. Punishment often escalated when women challenged expectations. In Lübeck, a woman named Giesnerken was executed in 1414. After being found guilty of adultery and allegedly seducing multiple men. Her case was marked not by the act itself, far from rare, but by her defiance and the number of men involved. Her body was publicly burned. The church played a central role in these processes. Penitential manuals used by confessors outlined detailed punishments for sexual sins, prescribing years of fasting, pilgrimage, or exclusion from the sacraments. But secular courts adopted similar logic. Women found guilty of leading men into sin could be placed in stocks, shaved, bald, or beaten with rods. In some towns, brothel workers were required to wear identifying badges or clothing visible markers of moral failure sanctioned by law. Resistance was rare, but not absent. Some women fled jurisdictions before judgment. Others used legal channels to challenge accusations, particularly in regions like southern France, where Roman law traditions allowed more structured defense. But success was uncommon. The overwhelming legal culture treated female sexuality as a potential source of chaos, and the role of the court was to contain it. Medieval legal systems did not simply punish behavior. They reinforced a worldview in which a woman's body was a vessel of honor, suspicion, and surveillance. Her morality was never hers alone. It belonged to the church, the law, and the eyes of the crowd. In medieval Europe, a woman's body was not her own. Her sexuality, her choices, and even her silence were shaped by institutions that defined what was acceptable and what was not. For those born outside the protections of marriage and nobility, two dominant paths emerged: the brothel and the cloister. One labeled her a sinner, the other a saint. Both served the same function: control. Prostitution was not illegal in most medieval European cities. In fact, it was regulated, taxed, and sanctioned by both civic authorities and the church, from London's Southwark to the municipal brothels of Cologne. Local governments established red light districts where sex work could take place under official oversight. The logic was simple: better to contain vice than to allow it to spread unchecked. Prostitution was called a necessary evil, a concession to male desire. Thomas Aquinas described it as the sewer of society, unpleasant, but vital for keeping the rest of the structure clean. Women working in brothels were subject to strict rules. They had to register with authorities, pay fees, and adhere to curfews. Many were required to wear distinctive clothing, yellow hoods, or striped dresses to mark them as public women. Their earnings were often split with brothel keepers or municipal officials. Few entered the trade by choice. Many were driven there by poverty, abandonment, or coercion. Some were former servants or widows with no dowry. Others were trafficked across regions by pimps or unscrupulous landlords. In contrast stood the convent. The cloistered life of a nun was idealized in religious and moral literature as the highest expression of female virtue. Nuns lived under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, separated from the outside world in monasteries that often held both religious and economic power. For noble families, placing a daughter in a convent was a practical solution. It reduced the need for a dowry and secured spiritual prestige. For some women, monastic life offered genuine opportunity, access to literacy, leadership, and even influence. Abbesses, like Hildegard of Bingen, held considerable authority within their communities. Yet the convent, like the brothel, was a structure built on restriction. Chastity was enforced by rule and routine. Entry into the cloister was often irreversible. Women who attempted to flee faced legal consequences. In some cases, novices were placed in convents against their will, girls as young as 12, committed to lives of celibacy before they could consent. Despite the apparent moral divide between the two worlds, they were deeply connected. Municipalities that licensed brothels often justified them as a way to protect virtuous women, particularly nuns and wives, from male temptation. The brothel existed so the cloister could remain untouched, and yet there were cases where the boundaries blurred. In 15th century France, some nuns were caught in scandals involving secret lovers and pregnancies. In Venice, archival records show women moving between sex work and religious life depending on their fortunes. Both institutions reflected the same underlying belief that female sexuality must be supervised, confined, and interpreted by male authority. Whether punished or praised, the woman's body remained under watch. In a society anxious about sin, piety, and control, the prostitute and the nun were not opposites. They were two sides of the same system. In a society that demanded silence, submission, and chastity from women, a few refused to comply. They spoke, wrote, preached, and challenged the boundaries that defined acceptable womanhood in medieval Europe. Their voices survive not in legend, but in manuscripts, visions, and trials, and each one left a record of defiance. Hildegard of Bingen was born in 1098 in the Rhineland and entered religious life at a young age. By the 12th century, she had become abbess of her own convent, led a community of nuns, and claimed to receive divine visions. Unlike many mystics of the period, Hildegard documented her revelations in Latin, with full theological commentary. Her most famous work, Sevilla's, included visions of the cosmos, the Church, and the role of women in salvation history. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and bishops, and her authority in matters of doctrine, music, and medicine. Her writings often placed women at the center of spiritual life, and she criticized corruption in the clergy with open force. While the Church eventually accepted her as a prophet, her rise was not without resistance. She faced scrutiny from male authorities and had to defend her visions as authentic rather than heretical. But Hildegard's success came, in part, because she framed her authority as divinely granted. She did not claim power on her own, she claimed it had been given. Margery Kempe took a different path. A merchant's wife from King's Lynn in England, she lived in the late 14th and early 15th centuries and bore 14 children before experiencing a religious awakening. Unlike Hildegard, Kempe had no formal education, yet she dictated the Book of Margery Kempe, now recognized as the first known autobiography in English. In it, she chronicled her pilgrimages, visions of Christ, and repeated weeping fit episodes. She described as uncontrollable signs of divine intimacy. She insisted on a vow of chastity despite being married, a decision that shocked her community and her husband. Margery traveled across Europe and the Holy Land, preaching repentance and challenging clergy despite being accused repeatedly of heresy and arrested more than once. Though she was never convicted, her behavior, public displays of devotion, refusal to conform to expectations of modesty, and silence made her a figure of suspicion. Her claim to spiritual authority without church sanction placed her on the edge of legal danger. Christine de Pizan, writing in the court of France in the early 15th century, did not claim visions. She claimed intellect, widowed at 25 and left. To support her family, she turned to writing. Her most famous work, the Book of the City of Ladies, directly challenged misogynistic tropes common in the literature of her time, particularly those in the Romance of the Rose, a widely read allegory that portrayed women as deceitful and driven by lust. Christine constructed an allegorical city populated entirely by virtuous women from history and legend. Joan of Arc, the Queen of Sheba, even the Virgin Mary. Her arguments were grounded in logic, scripture, and precedent. She defended women's education, dignity, and moral capacity, positions rarely made publicly by either gender in her era. While she enjoyed some protection from the French court, her writing was met with skepticism from male scholars who questioned both her authority and her audacity. Each of these women operated within strict limits, but pushed against them, whether through theology, travel, or political writing. They forced medieval society to confront an uncomfortable reality that a woman could be articulate, powerful, and unafraid. Some were canonized, some were nearly condemned, but all were reminders that control over women's voices was never absolute and never uncontested. In the 21st century, the language is different, but the patterns are familiar. The fear of women's sexuality that once fueled canon law, public punishments, and inquisitorial trials has not disappeared. It has shifted, rebranded, and embedded itself in new institutions. Modern purity culture, most visible in parts of conservative religious communities, echoes medieval concerns with chastity and moral worth. In some schools, girls are still taught that their value is tied to virginity. Abstinence pledges, purity rings, and modesty teachings reflect a belief that female desire is dangerous, something to be controlled, hidden, or surrendered only within marriage. These ideals draw directly from Christian traditions that portrayed Eve as the origin of sin and Mary as the unreachable ideal. Dress codes continue to enforce the idea that female bodies are inherently distracting or provocative. In schools and workplaces across North America and Europe, girls are penalized for exposed shoulders or short skirts, not for violating functional rules, but for making others uncomfortable. The responsibility is placed not on those reacting to their appearance, but on the women themselves. In this logic, centuries-old notions of temptation and guilt are still at play. Legal systems in many countries still reflect unequal standards. In some nations, women can be prosecuted or punished for adultery, moral indecency, or violating cultural expectations of modesty. In others, victims of sexual violence are interrogated about their clothing, their behavior, or their past, suggesting that responsibility can still be shifted onto the female body. Online spaces are no different. Women who express sexuality publicly through clothing, speech, or identity often become targets of harassment, moral judgment, or censorship. Whether through viral outrage or algorithmic suppression, the result is a familiar one: control through fear and shame. The same ideas that drove medieval trials who controls a woman's body and who decides what is acceptable still shape the boundaries of expression today. But there are also breaks in the pattern. Women speak out more freely. Laws change. Institutions face resistance. Historical narratives, once written entirely by men in power, are now being challenged and rewritten. Still, the long shadow of the medieval worldview lingers. The belief that female sexuality must be supervised did not vanish with the fall of feudalism or the rise of modern states. It adapted through religion, law, culture, and media. And so, the question remains: how much of what we believe today about women's bodies, choices, and roles is truly new, and how much is inherited from a past we've never fully left behind?